From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us in the Law Library of Congress's celebration of National Women's History Month. We're very fortunate to have two ladies with us today. First, our Associate Librarian of Library Services, Deanna Markham, and of course, our guest speaker, Congresswoman Morella. Since you probably heard as much from me as you'd like to, I will turn it over to Deanna. Deanna Markham.
I'm just checking to see if the sound is on. Can you hear me all right? Good, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to this program that recognizes women's contributions to history. We have a distinguished woman history maker as our speaker today, and I'm so grateful to the staff of the Law Library for organizing this program. I'm going to talk just a moment about the Law Library before I introduce our speaker, Ambassador Morella, because I want to make sure that everyone knows a little bit about the Law Library of Congress. It holds the largest collection of legal books and materials in the world. There are about 2.65 million volumes in the Law Library here. But it has another distinctive feature. It's not just a library, it's also a research center. We do comparative foreign and international law, and it makes this a really vibrant center of collecting the legal materials from around the world and then having the staff, about 20 specialists who speak all of the languages and understand all of the laws, who can do this legal research that makes such a difference to Congress and, as a result, to the American people. I think we really do want to applaud the work they do, and of course there's much that they do that pertains to women's history and women's legal research. Just in the last few years, they have done multinational studies on women's rights, women's law. They have done regional studies on the status of women, and they have done several country reports analyzing the laws in a specific country and how those laws pertain to women. This is, of course, very important to the United States Congress as they think about making laws for us. How do our laws compare to other countries, and what are the international ramifications? So it is in this context that the Law Library has put together this program and invited Ambassador Constance, I think we all know her better as Connie Morella. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about her connection to the Library of Congress. It was exactly 7 years ago, March 2002. Ambassador Morella was then a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. She got a call from Dr. Billington, the Librarian of Congress, and the two of them made national news by going to the Victor Kemkin bookstore in Rockville and rescuing books that were destined for the incinerator. There were pictures of them on television. I don't know if any of you remember seeing them. They were in the dumpster, bringing materials out and saving them. Well, it was really important that these Russian materials were saved. The landlord was evicting the bookstore. But among the things that were saved, just one item, a 12th century law book from the Ukraine. And it was very important that these things be saved. So we applaud you and your work, and I treasure the pictures of you and Dr. Billington in the dumpster. That was really quite something. From 1987 until 2003, Ambassador Morella represented me and all of Maryland's 8th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. where she developed a national reputation as a leading advocate for women, children, and families. She chaired the Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues, and she was co-chair of the Congressional delegation to the UN Women's Conference in Beijing. Among the legislation she sponsored were the 1992 Battered Women's Testimony Act, which provided funds for indigent women to hire expert testimony in domestic abuse cases, and the Judicial Training Act, which funded programs to educate judges about domestic violence, especially in child custody cases. While serving as the American ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, from 2003 until 2007, she continued to promote women's empowerment, and she spoke widely in all parts of the world. Earlier in her political career, Ambassador Morella was appointed in 1971 as a founding member of the Montgomery County Commission for Women, an advisory group of women who advocated for women's rights and women's status. She was elected president of that group in 1973, and she was also active in the League of Women's Voters. Ambassador Morella has received numerous awards. She was inducted into the Maryland Women's Hall of Fame and the Hubert H. Humphrey Civil Rights Award from the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. Before her political career, she was a professor of English at Montgomery College in Rockville, Maryland, proving once again, just as Garrison Keillor tells us every week, that English majors can do anything. And we are so grateful for the many contributions you have made to America, to our government, to all of us. We welcome you to the Library of Congress.
Well, I'm Connie Morella, and I approve this message. It's really great to be here at the Library of Congress with the law librarians here who are so important. I want to demonstrate my appreciation to Charles Doyle for his presence and for his welcome. And I want to thank you, Dina Markham, for your very generous introduction and for your leadership. It reminds me very much of a statement attributed to Mae West, who once said, "Too much of a good thing can be downright enjoyable." So it went on, but I enjoyed it very much. So thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Doyle, also. Wow, I was just amazed that you even knew about that Victor Campkin bookstore saga. It did go on, and I must say that your Librarian of Congress, Charles Billington, gave great credibility and commitment to something that could have happened. So in partnership, we were able to make sure that those books went to libraries and went to people who could use them. And so I was just amazed that you even knew about it. So I'm really very flattered about that. It is true that in 1800, the Library of Congress was established, and in 1832, you all became part of it, the bill that established the law library. And now, as you mentioned, it was at 2.56 million volumes and 100 wonderful staff, like some of you who are here today, dedicated experts. You have established the largest law library in the world. Imagine even providing, as I understand it, copies of an established Afghan law, which the Taliban had systematically destroyed during its 5-year rule, that you have it here. And then, of course, I'm thrilled to hear about the work that you mentioned that's being done on women, domestic violence. I think you're doing some comparative study with 10 countries with responses to domestic violence. So you do a lot of wonderful work, and I appreciate it. And of course, during my 16 years in Congress, I very heavily relied on you for reference, for research in the work that I did. And I know members of Congress do the same. And if they don't, they're missing out a great opportunity for potential source. You know, I saw a quote that I liked, and you probably have heard it, Barbara Tuchman, who wrote, "Books are the carriers of civilization. Without books, history is silent, literature dumb, science crippled, thought and speculation at a standstill. Books are humanity in print." And I think that should be something that inspires you in the work that you do and the importance and value of what you contribute. Well, I was invited here by a gal I met in a parking lot, and she had a Prius and I had a Prius, and I think she wanted to open the door of my Prius because it was the same color, as a matter of fact, Hong Sha-Lin Liu, and she's the Director of Legal Research, as you know. And I was chauffeured here today by her daughter, Lu Mei Wang, who is a student at Tufts, who was riding in that very Prius. So I'm very happy that she invited me and followed through with it, because it is a tribute and a real thrill for me to be here. I'd also like to recognize a couple of other people that I've known in my path of legislating in heels, as they say. And I was sure I had to wear some heels today. I thought, if I don't, they're going to wonder, what is she saying? She's not following through. But I wanted to recognize the president of Women's Policy, Inc. You probably know about them because they do the tracking of legislation and have many meetings on the Hill. To which you are probably invited, and if not, could be, and that's Cindy Hall. Cindy was my legislative director, and I'm glad that she's here. Thank you, Cindy. And also the president of the National Research Center for Women and Families. Does a lot of wonderful work. Diana Zuckerman is here also. Thank you, Diana, for being here, too. Well, you know, I felt a responsibility, since this is Women's History Month, to talk about her story, past, present, and in the future. And I thought it would be more authentic to use some of the examples, the anecdotes from my own history as sort of signposts. I will note, though, that your time is limited, and I want to give you an opportunity to also ask questions and make comments. And a line that has been attributed to Elizabeth Taylor, I can't resist using it. I've used it before, but it was, she said to her 8th husband, "I won't keep you long." But I will, as a sidebar, say that I was going to say it on Capitol Hill when I was there, and I looked around in the audience, and there was John Warner. And so I didn't. It's a good thing I recognized who it was. But as an educator who was appointed, as was mentioned by Deanna, who was appointed to the first commission for women in Montgomery County, that was in 1971, it was a time of awareness of gender inequities. I lobbied for equity for women in credit, housing, employment, education. Some of you may remember that at that time, if you were an employed young married woman, you would probably be denied the opportunity to get credit on a home mortgage, sometimes even a job, because you are capable of being pregnant, and that would take you away from being able to earn the money. Do you remember when a single woman would have difficulty getting housing because of the redlining that took place in certain neighborhoods? And do you remember when want ads were separated? There was a section for women, and then there was a section for men, and obviously, you know, women were directed into only certain professions, the highest of them being, you know, teacher, maybe librarian, nurse, secretary. And no opportunity to forge into some of the other areas. And you remember when women couldn't be Rhodes Scholars? Merely because they were women. And of course, you never had principals in schools that were women, except maybe for some rural, small elementary school, but never in high school, certainly not college presidents. Well, the women's movement in that regard put the movement into me, and that's when I got involved with doing more with regard to equity for women. And of course, remember the Equal Rights Amendment? That was being lobbied at that time too. And Maryland passed it, I must say, but it's still not a constitutional amendment, kind of been put aside. Well, that inspired me to want to have a seat at the table and engage in legislation. I was elected after much hard work in 1978 and a lot of shoe leathering, knocking on doors, and I very often had the question about, well, now, who are you supporting? I said, I'm the candidate. And then I was actually asked rather often about, are you running as a woman? That was a hard one to answer. Now I think I'm running as a man. My kids used to say, and Cindy, I know you've heard this often, elect our mother and get her off the streets. And that is really a mantra that they used. Well, I served on the Appropriations Committee in the Maryland General Assembly, and I had the subcommittee on law enforcement and transportation. And I'll tell you a little anecdote, again, about being a woman, driving to Annapolis on a Tuesday when we weren't in session, but my committee was in session, and being stopped by a police officer for, he said speeding. I didn't think I was, but there was no traffic on the road, and I just said, oh, sir, I'm very sorry. I didn't mean to. If I wasn't aware of it. I won't do it again. And didn't say a word and didn't have much of a personality. And he went to the back of the car, and he looked at the license plate, which said Maryland House of Delegates, District 16. And he then came back and he wrote something down, and he gave it to me, and it was a warning. And I said, oh, thank you, officer. I really won't violate the speed limit again. And he said, well, I didn't do it for you. I did it for your husband, the delegate. Well, and the only reason I tell you that story really is because then when I went into that meeting, it happened to be the financial, or the budget justification for the criminal justice, which included the police. And the police superintendent, the superintendent of the Maryland Police, came before that subcommittee at that time. So it was just a great opportunity to be able to discuss what needed to be done in the way of personnel training of those people who are representing us too. So, okay. I also think that represents time wounds all heals, and I don't mean the shoe leather heels either. Okay, after 8 years in the Maryland legislature, I won a seat in the House of Representatives, and I always said that was to reduce my driving time in half, so I didn't have to go to Annapolis. I'd go to Capitol Hill, which was half the driving time. But I'm only kidding. There were 24 women in the House out of 435. Now there are 78, including Guam and District of Columbia. Hey, she may have a vote someday, but I think it'll go to the Supreme Court first, but we'll see what happens. And we became part of, those 24 women became part of a Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues, which is bipartisan. It has always been bipartisan. It still is bipartisan, probably the only group on the Hill that truly is bipartisan, with two co-chairs, a Democrat and a Republican. Now, of course, we all worked on issues beyond those that seem so much like women's issues. I was on the Science Committee. I had a lot of federal employees that I worked for, human rights, a number of other issues, technology issues that I was involved in, but always felt a responsibility to that Women's Caucus and to working together on issues that were important to society, I'm very proud. Did we make a difference? Yeah, you bet we did. I'm very proud of the Violence Against Women Act, which after many years of individual bills, some that were mentioned in the introduction, through many separate bills, got put together into landmark legislation, finally passed in 1994. It was then reauthorized in 2000. I was the prime sponsor of the House version of that bill. Incidentally, Joe Biden was very helpful all the way along the line on the violence against women issues. It's since then it's been authorized 2005. You'll have another one coming up in 2010. But if you can imagine, that was the dirty little secret that had been hidden under the rug. Nobody would talk about it. If somebody was absent from the office, nobody really questioned the pattern of her absences or the fact that she had a black eye or some other bruises. Everybody had blinders on. It was not to be anybody's business. At any rate, it developed shelters, domestic violence hotline, training for law enforcement, judiciary, even date rape, protections for immigrant women, and many, many issues, as I say, that had been introduced separately, and it is working. It is working. In progress right now is an International Violence Against Women Act. A group of organizations have come together in collaboration and are putting it together. And I hope, maybe in this Congress, if not, I hope in the next Congress at least, that it will be something that will pass. It's a great coalition. Well, another issue, NIH in our backyard here, is a great institution. But at the time I was in Congress early on, women were not being included in clinical trials or protocols. Women were like little men. You know, even the experimentation was done on male rats. And so I don't know whether they thought that women were too sensitive to be engaged in clinical trials or really what the rationale was. But certainly we needed to make known that anatomically, we are not little men. And so sure enough, eventually, the Office of Research on Women's Health was established. I remember going to NIH. Bill Robb was the acting director at that time to discuss this. And it was Barbara Mikulski, Pat Schroeder, Olympia Snow, and myself. And that office finally became law. And we still have the same director, Vivian Penn, who was there at the very beginning. It has made a difference. You know the findings, the reports that they have done have changed the mentality and changed the procedures of what people have done medically. You've seen those various studies. So I'm very proud of that. Findings that have saved women's lives, and whether research on women and heart problems, the #1 killer, HIV and AIDS, which had been put aside, autoimmune diseases, women are now included. I want to mention in all this legislation, too, since I mentioned Joe Biden, that women, 24 women at that time, the 74 women at this time, couldn't do it alone. I mean, hey, you're talking about a range of up to 435 people in the House alone, and then 100 in the Senate. So you had to get the men to be involved. And indeed, if they could see some leadership, and they could see the need, and they could see how it could help them in their districts and their own personal beliefs, they made a difference. So I'm not talking about doing any of these things alone. I'm talking about leadership, and I'm talking about good follow-ship and leadership, too. For instance, Violence Against Women Act, I'd also like to say Orrin Hatch on the Senate side was also very helpful. And again, there were men on the House side, too, that in both parties there were, too. Legislation establishing a commission to encourage, engage, train, and retain women, minorities, and people with disabilities in science, engineering, and technology resulted. It was a commission that I had introduced, passed, resulted in findings that have led to public-private partnerships, and some of the advances we have seen, but so much more needs to be done in that field. That's a field where we need to forge ahead further. Now, before I go into the future, I want to go back into the real past and say that, hey, in the state of Maryland, we had a gal who was the first woman in our country to ever ask for the right to vote. Who was it? Margaret Brent. Margaret Brent was actually a lawyer, and she handled a lot of cases for Lord Baltimore in Maryland. This was 1648. She appeared before the Maryland General Assembly, and she asked for that right to vote as a property owner, and she was denied. The General Assembly celebrated its 350th anniversary. I was there in the Maryland General Assembly at the time. It was 1984, and at that time they met at St. Mary's City, where the Ark and the Dove had come in for the founding, and posthumously gave Margaret Brent the right to vote. Well, too little and too late, but nevertheless, it was a symbol. May it be a beacon. And then who would have thought that a state like Montana
would have given women the right to vote before they could nationally, and that's true. And that's how Jeanette Rankin in 1916 was the first woman elected to the House of Representatives. And remember, women didn't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment in 1920, but she was there. What's interesting about Jeanette Rankin is that she voted against 2 world wars. The only woman in history ever to have, only person, I think, in history to have ever voted against both world wars. She voted against the First World War, and then she ran for the Senate. She lost that race for the Senate, so she was out. But then she came back in 1940 to the House of Representatives, so she voted against the Second World War. And then she didn't run again. Yeah, but it's interesting. You'll see her statue now when the Visitors Center was taken from the Capitol, but now that new Visitors Center, you will see Jeanette Rankin. Then, as I go beyond that, I bet you don't know. You're law librarians. You know everything. But have you ever heard of Coya Knutson? Coya Knutson, K-N-U-T-S-E-N. Coya Knutson, she was elected in 1954 from Minnesota. And she had actually served in the state legislature from 1950 until she was elected in 1954 to the federal House of Representatives. Her husband was very resentful of her political career, and he wrote a letter to the editor. He wrote a letter to the editor, which was published in 1958 when she was running for her 3rd election to the House of Representatives, and it was called the famous Coya Come Home letter. It was printed in the Fargo newspaper, but the Associated Press got word of it, and so it spread, like throughout the country. And in this letter he said, "Due to wifely neglect, my family life has deteriorated to the point where it is non-existent." Well, did Coya win that race? You know where I'm going. No, she lost it. She lost that race. She then, the papers then did sort of an expose. It was her then former husband was found to be an alcoholic. And so she even went to court, I think, and got her dollar because she prevailed. But she then ran again. And was she elected? No. She could not. She could not unburden herself with that stigma of the fact that she had the responsibility for the dissolution of that marriage and for getting her family life. Well, what I thought was interesting is that she became a civil servant. She worked in one of our agencies, and I think she died. I should have looked up the exact date, because it was probably about 10 years ago she died, and the Washington Post did an obituary article on her. And in the article, they talked about, at one point in their boardroom, interviewing her after that letter had come out, and how they found out that she had been a victim of domestic violence. And then it was like, but why didn't you bring this out? And she said, because things like that are family matters, and they should be kept private. So you see, that was an attitude at the time. So Google her. Go check her out. The Coya Come Home letter. Well, progress still needs to be made with our 95 women in 535-member Congress. 17%. People say, oh, what a wonderful percentage, but it really isn't. I mean, actually, in our Maryland legislature, I think it's like 33%. But even then, we have a way to go. Of course, now we can claim a woman speaker, a woman who ran for president, and 2 women who have been vice presidential candidates. We have some women also who are chairing some committees and certainly some subcommittees. We have advanced with women in the law. I know there are many lawyers in this room. We have moved from that infamous Bradwell versus State case in 1872. Any of you remember that, Bradwell versus State? Okay, 1872. A woman named Myra Bradwell in the state of Illinois was denied the opportunity to practice at the bar of her state on the grounds that, this is a quote, strife of the bar would destroy femininity. The case went to the Supreme Court, which upheld Illinois on an 8-1 decision. upheld Illinois. Justice Bradley wrote the decision, and the decision ended with this phrase of this sentence: "The natural and proper timidity of women unfits them for certain professions of civil life. The paramount destiny of woman is as wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator." Amen. That was it. Well, what I think is interesting is that Sandy Day O'Connor, when she became the first woman on the Supreme Court, actually cited that case. And so Justice Bradley, so there. Yeah, finally. Actually, we have more than 52% of the women are going to law school now, and there were so few. In fact, my husband is emeritus from American University Law School, which actually was founded by women for women. When women couldn't get into law school, except a few were accepted at Howard, that was it. So we have made some advances, but I would like to point out that with women as courtroom lawyers, with women as judges, with women in law firms, there's still a vacuum of women as partners and principals in major law firms. So there's still a way to go. Okay, education, something you all care about. I mentioned when women could be principals only of maybe an elementary school, couldn't be Rhodes Scholars. But now, not only is there a great percentage, greater than a majority percentage of women going to graduate school, but you are finally having the breakthrough with women college presidents. At Harvard, a woman is president. At MIT, across the Charles, a woman is president. Swarthmore just elected their first woman president. I noticed that the American University in Paris has an American woman president. And so on it is happening. So we have had some major breakthroughs. And even Donna Shalala is president, former HHS, is president at the University of Miami. And so now, and also looking at medicine. And now when you're in the hospital and you see this young woman, she's probably your surgeon and not the nurse that you expected. Incidentally, we have a shortage of nurses. We could use more men nurses, as a matter of fact, to help with that. Our Office of Research on Women's Health and in similar offices and other agencies have elevated women as health professionals. And I'm reminded of the story of a little boy and girl playing medicine. The boy has a stethoscope, and he says, I'm going to be the doctor, and you can be the secretary. And she says, okay, I'll be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And so sure enough, not only did we have Donna Shalala, but we now have a Secretary of Health and Human Services, Governor Kathleen Sebelius of Kansas, right? But we do need to, as I said earlier, need to get more women into science, engineering, and technology fields. We need to encourage them. We need to attract them. We need to promote them. We need to retain them. We need more women in boardrooms and in financial partnerships. While 42% of the U.S. workforce is female, under 15% of Fortune 500 corporate offices are. And just 2.4% of the CEOs of these companies are women. My friends, perhaps if there had been more women in banking as executives, there would have been more transparency, there would have been more monitoring, there would have been higher ethics in this financial tsunami. I am shocked. As I was getting ready to leave this morning, I found an article, Bring the Boys Along. I don't know whether any of you have seen this, by Kathleen Parker. It doesn't indicate where she's from, though. I think she's Concerned Women or something, because I think her name rings a bell with me in some way. What she is saying in that is basically that President Obama has said that he is going to come out with a White House Council on Women and Girls to ensure that all cabinet-level agencies consider how their policies affect women and families. And she says, where? You need one for men and boys. Women are getting everything. Basically, she even made the statement that it's that you know that we don't need that particular council. There should be one for boys. But as an illustration, she states that women take more leave than men for childbirth and childcare. Isn't that a shock?
What a surprise. She says because of that you have the wage gap and other things that maybe women are complaining about.
I think she's the same woman who wrote an article during the presidential campaign that got an overwhelming response from individuals, men, women, organizations, saying that women are kind of inferior. They're not strong enough to be leaders, that they do have certain problems. They are too soft, etc. I'm going to double check it. I'll let you know. And I hope you'll do the same thing too. But in terms of looking ahead, Congress now is reauthorizing or considering reauthorizing the Foreign Assistance Act. I think very much that women need to be more integrated into our foreign assistance programs. There are many duplications. There are many programs that are not working. There are many programs that are not getting to the women and the children for education and health and micro-enterprise and other things. As a matter of fact, I was honored to join with Ritu Sharma Fox, who has an organization called Women Thrive Worldwide, and they have an editorial or an op-ed that collectively that we wrote in the Baltimore Sun today on that very issue, the whole concept of now that we move ahead with the foreign assistance reauthorization, it's a good time to do it. Also pointing out that there is now an office of women's global affairs in the State Department, and they have a woman, Milan Verveer, who's been with Vital Voices, who is called Ambassador at Large. So it says something more about an emphasis on women globally, and I think that's something that is critically important. Well, at any rate, after 16 years in the House, and after that in an unelection, I went from Paris Glendenning, who was governor of Maryland, to Paris, France, where I was the OECD ambassador. Not bad, not bad. I think that was a pretty good victory. I worked with the ambassadors of 30 most developed countries in the world, formulating conventions, best practices, using very strong peer review enforcement. OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, too many letters, too many words, so people don't remember it. They say, oh, it's that Paris-based group or that statistical group or whatever. But it came from the Marshall Plan that had the original 16 countries, European countries, and then in 1961, Congress expanded it, and it began to include the Asian countries and North American countries, so Korea, New Zealand, Japan, Australia, Canada, Mexico are all part. The 30 most industrialized countries in the world are part of what OECD is. The Marshall Plan, when George Marshall spoke at Harvard, and he talked about a family of nations, came up with an incredibly unique idea of helping these countries that were torn by the war, and helping them by giving them money and expertise to build up their infrastructures and build up their educational system, their health system, transportation. And what was unique about it, he convinced the American public who were themselves trying to come together after this World War. And but what was unique about the program was that he didn't tell these countries what to do. He told them, the plan, the economic recovery plan, he told them, you decide what you need, and then we will help you. And so when people talk about the legacy of the Marshall Plan, they're also talking about people knowing what they need to do and doing it for themselves with assistance. It was the French foreign minister who had once had said something about Ernest Bevin, who had said that Churchill helped to win the war, and Marshall helped to win the peace. So from that came OECD. OECD operates by consensus, which means 30 people representing 30 countries have got to come together. What if Congress ever did something like that? It means you had to work out compromises, you had to work together, find out what your government wanted, what OECD generally wanted, and then work out something. There are a number of successes. Anti-bribery convention came about because of OECD. It used to be that you could bribe a international public official for something you wanted. Maybe it still happens now. No, that you could bribe them. And as a matter of fact, in a country like France, which was the headquarters of OECD, you could even use it as a tax deduction. Well, now 40 countries have signed that anti-bribery convention to make it illegal. We call that leveling the playing field. Despite what Tom Friedman said, there are still some bumps, and so that helps with removing one of those bumps. Principles of Corporate Governance came out back in '99, reformed in 2004, even incorporating Sarbanes-Oxley in that. But it's used by World Bank, had been used by International Monetary Fund. The International Energy Agency is part of OECD, and the current financial crisis has enlisted the support and recommendation of OECD. Well, when I arrived at OECD, in 2003, I was one of 7 women ambassadors among the 30 ambassadors, with 6 husbands. And and that was 6 husbands, not each of us having 6 husbands. And now there are fewer. Now there are only like 4 women ambassadors who are there. But the men, our spouses, got together and they formed sort of a social group and would meet periodically for lunch and just to chit-chat. And they decided they needed to have a name, and it was a Canadian ambassador's spouse who said, I think we should be the We Chérie, the Yes Dear Club. So they became known as the Yes Dear Club, which does continue. My husband would say, I used to be part of Who's Who, now I'm Who's He. But hey, living in Paris isn't bad. Despite the fact that I want you to know that I was driven in a bulletproof car. You couldn't even open the windows. If you had a station where you had to pay a toll, you had to open the door. That I had security, 2 French security with me at all times. I was the only ambassador of those 30 countries that had French security with me at all times. The French government provided it, not the American government, and they're the ones who wanted it, which says something about how they thought that there must be something that would appeal to terrorists about the United States. So it was kind of interesting. I didn't do that much shopping, folks, because I would have to have them. If I wanted to try something on, I got the 2 guys with me. So my husband was appreciative of that. Nevertheless, they were really very fine people. As a matter of fact, you know, that division was what Sarkozy was in charge of, the Department of Interior. He was in charge of that before he became president. And it was interesting to be there to see how they conduct a presidential election. But we don't have time to go into all of that, but I do have some ideas about it. I do want to suggest that, to point out whatever it means in terms of a suggestion, that our residents did not have an American flag raised because of security. We were told not to do that. So it seems to me that the feeling about Americans in the world has always been high, continues to be, but the feeling about America had diminished and had been diminishing through the years. The expectations and challenges that face our new president are high. Up front, the Wall Street meltdown has shaken markets and governments throughout the world. It's a crucible of confidence in global capitalism. And the free world looks to President Obama for the leadership, for the near-term structural fix, and for regulatory oversight, transparency, and accountability for future prevention. Our president must pursue sustained diplomacy, which former Secretary of State George Shultz characterized as the gardening task of foreign policy. Must listen, learn, lead with confidence and a touch of humility. I would say, ladies and gentlemen, we can all learn from the Marshall Plan that when nations work together, they can overcome the gravest of challenges. That's something we face right now. We are indeed a family of nations, and for our future, we must so remain. So I want to thank you, sisters and men who get it, for your service and your commitment to a world of equality and opportunity. And to all, especially women, I offer the advice of Admiral Grace Hopper. She said, a ship in port is safe, but that's not what ships are for. Sail on. Sail on, my friends, and thank you very much. Thank you. Okay? All right. And now, a few questions, comments. Yes?
If you could come back to Capitol Hill or Tsarina for a day, what would be the one big thing you would want to change?
The one thing I'd want to change? I want to change attitudes. I mean, the concept of civility has kind of gone asunder. I know that in the last election, I had members on both sides of the aisle who would say to me, I don't dare get on legislation that someone in the other party has introduced for fear of recriminations. I just can't be seen that way. Or I can't be seen talking on the floor of the House for too long with somebody of another party. Those are just isolated comments, but the sense of not working together, being separate, is one that has rubbed off into the people, and therefore you find even now trust and confidence in Congress is very low, even with their own members. I love Congress. It's very important. I won't do anything to disparage the House of Representatives and the Senate, but I must say I think attitudes need to change, and I think a lot of things need to be done. I think it can start from the top, and I hope that more and more we will begin to see some working together for what's in the best interests of our country. Okay. Okay. Yes.
You didn't mention that in your spare time you raised a family. I'm just wondering how that balancing act, how you see it, as it was for you and as it is now in terms of, change.
Well, when you have so many kids, you can almost allocate responsibilities. Tony and I, my husband and I, have raised 9 children. My late sister's 6 children, including twins that she had, plus our 3 biological children. That meant that we had 5 in high school at the same time, and those same 5 in college at the same time. So we suffered from maltuition. And I think I used to say to people when they would ask that kind of question, I'd say, oh, it's so good to get out of the house. But I think you need a sense of humor. You need a sense of priorities. And we would even allocate responsibilities to groups of them. Okay, this team is going to clear the table, do the dishes for a week. This team is going to clean the bathrooms for a week. Everybody was to do her own room. We even had a team that was doing laundry for a week, and that did not work. That did not work because someone would say, I'm missing a sock. My jeans should not have been put into the dryer. I mean, this is turning color or whatever. So all but the very youngest, who was 9 years of age, I showed them all how to use the washer, the dryer, got them each hampers and laundry baskets, and they then had to do their own laundry. But I had a husband who cooperated. Was he as good as his sons are in being fathers? No, because that wasn't done at the time. I mean, he was a lawyer and busy working all the time. But whatever time he had, he did help out, and he did give that kind of support network. When young women ask for a magical answer, I say there isn't one. And there are going to be times, but it's a matter of priorities and organization, but there are going to be times when you're going to feel guilty. I mean, just don't think you don't. I think men do too. Like, I should have spent more time doing this, or I wish I could have done this longer, or whatever. But that's all part of life. It's all part of the balancing act of life. So if it's something that you want to do, and of course I think you get more family-friendly policies now. Although we are still almost the only country in the world that doesn't give paid family medical leave for at least a number of weeks. I was there with the Family Medical Leave Act, and I was there at the signing, I think it was 1987, and but that was 12 weeks of unpaid leave. But every other country has office a lot. But there is more emphasis on family-friendly policies in companies. There are organizations, including the federal government agencies, which rank the private companies that are family-friendly and rank the federal agencies that are family-friendly. And telework is another thing that can be done. So we need to get the society to work together to make it a better situation for parents who want to work, who feel they can contribute something, or maybe have to work, and raise a family at the same time. And I think attitude is altitude. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about your experience as a representative. Was there ever an issue on which your constituents, of which I was one, happily, had strong feelings one way, but you had to, for reasons of conscience or belief, vote in an opposite way or in a way that you knew would be unpopular? And if so, what was it, and what did you, how did you?
That's a good question. Now remember, I spent 8 years as a minority in the minority, and 8 years as a minority in the majority. So you can see, I'm an example of not being of the party of the majority of the people in the district I represented. Hey, you know, that's not bad. You work around the clock, like Charlie Cook used to say, I would go to the opening of an envelope, you know. I told him now I can pick my openings, like coming here today. Yeah, so you see, for me, I'm out of the box. If we had more of that, you'd have more bipartisanship, because there would be the need to reach out, to work together. But unfortunately, the fewer and fewer. Yes, so I think there are many issues where I'm not sure what percentage of my constituency agreed with me, but I know a large number of my own party did not agree with me. I voted, and it was not an easy decision. I voted against the help me out. Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking of something ahead, too. I voted against the impeachment. And it wasn't that it wasn't perjurious. It was that it didn't imperil the nation. And that was what I predicated it on. Actually, I voted against going into Iraq. Again, in all these instances, I was one of like 5, members of my party to do that. But I felt, and I gave a speech on the floor of the House, too. I never announced my feeling on these things early, because I thought if I do, I'm going to be inundated by press. I'm going to get my constituency even more riled up. But I think that, voting against that, I really felt that we just needed to reach out to other countries to do more with the UN before we engaged in something like that. Because after it all happened, we all, united as we need to do in terms of moving ahead. I have had situations where on the impeachment and on the war, but particularly the impeachment, where even my children, I have a son who lives in Damascus and a daughter in Rockville and a son, who lives also in another part of Rockville, they would get people calling them, tell your mother to do thus and so. They would leave letters on my visor, my windshield wiper. They would leave things at the door. What I did is I have an answering service. We all have call answering, but I turned it off during that time. I mean, I had enough offices. I had a district office, a Capitol Hill office. I had another campaign office. So I just turned it off. I figured people can get through to me that way without coming into my home. So yeah, so it's been interesting. Yes.
As a follow-on to that question, for any member of any elected body, how does one balance the job that you were hired to do by the folks that hired you to do it, your constituency, and your own personal conscience, if you will, on, pick an issue, any issue. I'm not thinking about any one issue. I'm thinking about how do you balance what your bosses have elected you to do with what you as the individual think you ought to be doing.
That's also a very, very good question. I always felt that you responded to your country, your constituency, and your conscience. Those are the 3 C's that you look at. And I remember at a town meeting, I had a man who said to me, he's like the 5th questioner, and he was in the back of the room, and he said, "Mrs. Morella, I want to thank you for the letter you sent to me." And I thought, it's very nice. He said, "Because in it you told me why I was wrong." Now, he was kidding. But the point is, he was impressed that he got a letter from me, even though I was on the other side of his issue. So I would submit to you that more than a particular issue, it's, is she responsive? Does she listen to me? Did she have a reason for what she did? And then there was another thing I would do, and that is sometimes with late votes, I would get the names of people where my staff, there was no way they could answer some people who were pretty nasty in their letters. And so I just said, well, just leave them for me on the desk and get me the phone number. So while I'm in my office and votes are taking place in the evening, I would pick them up and I would just say, "Mr. Jones, this is Connie Morella." And there'd be a pause. And then I would say, this is Connie Morella, and I'm calling you. Oh, I didn't mean what I said. Well, without even mentioning what it was. Truly, I would recommend this to any member of Congress if they have really difficulties. And so then you just say, I just wanted you to know I read your letter. You didn't even really get much into a discussion of the issue. If they wanted to, you'd give them some information about why you disagreed or why this was happening this particular way. But what was beneficial about that was not only that I felt good, I'm getting through to somebody who didn't really mean to be as harsh as he was to my staff. But you know what he would do and others would do? They'd tell others in the neighborhood. I heard from our congresswoman. She called me. They never got into why they wrote to me or what the situation was. So it was a really good way of doing something like that. So and answer to your question, how do you know? Well, I did get around a lot. I did listen a lot. We made counts of letters that we got. I mean, you're getting an awful lot of letters on this particular issue, which is going to be coming up. I listened to my staff, too, because my staff had to specialize. Each one had to specialize in like 5 different subjects. And, of course, I did my committee work, and I had to know all of it. And so I would make the decision. But it was one where I honestly felt I could support what I had said. And if I didn't agree with my constituency 100%, I probably came close to 80%. My unelection, I had a 67% favorable. But again, redistricting is another element that unfortunately I think curtails nonpartisanship or postpartisanship, because if it makes districts just too safe and tidy for one party, then the person running looks to the primary voters. If you just get a list of your primary voters and you contact them, and very often they're on the left or they're on the right, but not always are they in the center, you know. And so if you're just playing to them, you maybe vote like they want, and maybe you do certain things that they would like, and there isn't really the need to get out to the others in that district or in other districts. And as a matter of fact, you know, it tends to isolate when you really think about the origin of it and how it tended to isolate groups. Thinking of, you know, minority groups really being isolated because they weren't out into the rest of the state or the rest of the world. Yes?
A lot of women legislators get pinned as, well, if you're a woman, you should support primarily women's issues. Has that ever been hard for you or some of your other peers?
I think it's been harder for my other peers, and not that hard for me, but you find some in terms of, let's say, the choice issue. And you will find members of the Women's Caucus on Capitol Hill who are both sides. You'll find there are some that are anti-choice and some that are pro-choice, so frankly, you stay away from that issue. if it comes out on the floor of the House, those who are for it can speak for it, those who are against it can speak against it. There aren't many women who speak against it on the floor of the House. Once in a while there's somebody, but that doesn't mean they don't vote. Again, they're voting probably constituent as they see the country and as they see their conscience. I have to believe that people do that. But yeah, they won't agree on everything. In fact, there was a bill in the state legislature, the Maryland legislature, you probably read about, which had to do with expunging the record of those people who are trial for domestic violence. And they had some women who had voted for the bill, which would expunge the record, and they were rather criticized, but they had different reasons for it. But it shows that women, again, anatomically, we're not like men, but also mentally, we're not, we're not, people are individuals. So, yes.
You lived in France, which has national health insurance. What's it going to take Congress to wrap their head around true health care reform and national health insurance?
Well, I think they're moving closer to it now. Judging from the meeting that the president put together, where he had like 2,500 people, I think, showed up, and he had insurers. He had the whole range of people involved in health insurance who were there, and they were there, and they seemed to be pretty upbeat about it. I think it's going to be. I think it's going to be something that's going to take time, by virtue of the expense, by virtue of the fact that you already have intact insurance companies. There are a lot of other elements out there that will come to the fore on it. I hope something happens. It was very interesting that in France, you're right, they have a recession there, as we do, if I can call it a recession. Sure, they've called it a recession. They have one, but they're not as worried as we are because they automatically have health insurance. And that's something that now people without a job are really concerned, am I going to have my health insurance? Now, you all have the federal employee plan, as I do too, and that's one that's being looked at as an example. I don't know how they're going to formulate that. And then also there's one, the Veterans Administration has one too, where they pay less for the various drugs that they need, medications that they need, by virtue of a pooling of some sort. So I hope something happens, and I know that the president wants to do something, but there are a lot of forces out there, just like a lot of challenges, just like there are a lot of forces on the cap and trade and the energy thing. Education he's spoken about too, and just I think what he wants to do is put out his whole platform, say all these things, and from the very beginning, I want to present them to the American people. These are things we need to work on, and we are going to work on. So I hope so. Yes.
Hi. In your speech, you really talked about that a change of mentality was needed for women to be more successful in the workplace. But I was wondering, because in Harm to Blade's Power of Place book, and also even in Stephen Levitt's Freakonomics, both authors conclude that the circumstances in which we're born in, society, culture, and even where your geographical circumstances are predeterminants of how successful you'll be in life. So I was wondering, how can you empower women to break the power of place, and how can the law create an environment of mobility for women?
Well, you just have to work bit by bit, but I think that's where national legislation helps. Certainly, you're dealing with cultural policies in some instances about like women should not be doing certain professions. It's not, you're dealing with geography because not in this area. We don't have these jobs available in this area. You're dealing with some religions too in many instances. So you've got all these factors. So what you do is you set up, I think federally, ideally, federally, you set up the guidelines, like the Violence Against Women Act. Now, what you have to make sure, too, with an act like that, as an example, is that it's enforced. But it's the same thing with all these other laws, is that you need to have adequate enforcement. Some areas probably don't, by virtue of the sentiment of the people or the again, the cultural situation, educational situation, and so you try to break through that way. Some states are even doing it on their own. They are looking at what the need is and trying to find ways of reaching a certain solution with what they have. Look at other countries too. There's also there's legislation dealing with some of the practices that other countries seem to have had, like the female genital cutting. That is something that is a feeling of a certain group, certain places, etc. So you just try to enlighten them. It's like reading a book. You can learn something as you read. You can learn something as society moves along, providing you have these motivators, providing you have these leaders who perceive that maybe something could be better, but you don't abolish it right away. But you recognize it in your public policy formulation. Now, remember, anybody wants to add something to it, you all are fonts of information, so you can say, no, I think it should be this way, or yes.
Can you discuss a little bit about how you may have had to be strategic in Congress getting some of these things passed, like the Violence Against Women Act or things like that? One instance that comes to mind is the cancer debate and the gendering of the cancer debate, where women eventually had to downplay their gender and brought in prostate cancer and made it much broader and actually helped to structure prostate cancer on the men's side. It wasn't. And then they got federally funded mammographies that way. So can you talk, in your career, how you had to be strategic in relation to gender?
Well, really, that's true. Even right now, I think many insurance companies will pay for Viagra, but not contraceptives. And there's a piece of legislation in now that will make it all equal. And until you begin to point out how egregious this is to make it one-sided, and I mean, one wants medication to prevent, the other one, I don't know. But actually, you do it a number of ways. First of all, you talk to your buddies, and you get your male friends, those that you work well with, and you try to convince them. What we used to do in the Women's Caucus, and we did it for some other bills too, that were kind of controversial. We had sort of a moderate group that got together. We would take the members of Congress and we would categorize them. These are the ones leaning. These are the ones, forget it. They're never going to come to your side except you can enlighten them at the last minute. These are the ones that you should, who can you talk to? And then I would end up with my list of like 5 names, people that are either on my committee or something. So we would do it that way, and then we report back in terms of how do they react to it. Do they need more information? Are they going to be on our side? Will they then talk to some others to do the multiplier effect, as I call it? I also found that organizations were very helpful. And coalition building, I think, is critical in passage of major legislation. These organizations, we have so many of them in the Washington area, but the organizations bring their members together, and they are committed. They are committed. Many of them consist of volunteers who are committed to issues. They are darn good with writing to their member of Congress, sending not only letters, but sending petitions and calling on the phone. And so when I look back at the history of some of the movement for equity, I could see an awful lot of organizations that were there at the beginning. Even the first shelters were, I think, a group of women from Massachusetts who, would put up women as shelters in their basements or whatever. So I think a lot of the coalition building, the reaching out to organizations to help you, because they reach other constituents too. Yeah. Okay. All right. I think I've kept you long enough. And so, happy Women's Month. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.